The courthouse was an old stone building, its tall windows filtering the morning sun into long golden beams that stretched across polished floors. Outside, the city bustled with its usual rhythm cars honking, pedestrians weaving through crosswalks, but inside the courtroom, time seemed to move differently. The thick wooden doors muffled the noise of the outside world, leaving only the faint shuffle of papers, the creak of chairs, and the low hum of anticipation. The trial had already drawn attention in the local press. The defendant, a man in his 30s with a pale, nervous face, stood accused of a late-night break-in that had left the neighborhood shaken. Though no one was physically hurt, the crime had unsettled many. For weeks, the community had whispered about what might happen in court. But today, as the second week of the trial began, everyone knew something unusual was about to take place. At the front of the room, Judge Harold Emerson sat in his elevated chair. A man in his 60s with silver hair and glasses that seemed too large for his narrow face. Emerson was known for his patience, but also for his firm control of proceedings. He tapped a pencil lightly against the bench, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though weighing every person present. The jury, 12 ordinary men and women, sat in 2 neat rows to the side. Some clutched notebooks filled with scribbled impressions. Others folded their hands in their laps. Their expressions ranged from solemn concentration to faint nervousness, for they too understood the uniqueness of the moment ahead. Near the judge's bench sat the attorneys. At the prosecution's table, Assistant District Attorney Karen Mills leaned forward, adjusting her stack of files. She was a sharp, driven woman in her 40s, known for her calm but relentless questioning. Across from her, Defense Attorney Paul Renner checked his watch, then smoothed the lapels of his suit jacket. His client, the defendant, avoided eye contact with anyone, staring instead at the floor. But it was not the lawyers or the defendant who captured the quiet attention of the room that morning. It was the German Shepherd, lying patiently near the prosecution's side. The dog was a large, well-trained police canine named Rex, his thick coat gleaming under the overhead lights. He sat beside his handler, Officer Mark Daniels, who wore his uniform with crisp precision. Rex did not bark, whine, or move much. Only the occasional flick of his tail or the slow rotation of his ears betrayed his alertness. Still, the presence of a police dog in a courtroom was enough to keep all eyes drifting toward him. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a booming voice, cleared his throat and addressed the room. All rise. The audience, family members, reporters, curious citizens stood as Judge Emerson entered. After a nod from the bailiff, the judge gestured for everyone to sit. The air grew heavier with expectation. This court will now reconvene in the matter of the state versus David Hensley, the judge announced. His voice, deep and steady, filled every corner of the room. We will continue with the prosecution's witness list. I am advised that the next witness is unusual in both age and circumstance. A ripple of whispers passed through the gallery. Everyone knew what was coming, but hearing it stated aloud made it real. A child only 3 years old would be brought to the stand. The idea was almost unthinkable. Children that young were rarely called to testify. Questions about their memory, their ability to separate truth from imagination, and the weight of their words always hovered over such decisions. Yet here they were, about to witness it firsthand. The prosecutor rose from her chair. Yes, Your Honor, the state calls Lily Harper to the stand. At the mention of her name, the room seemed to shift. Some of the jurors leaned forward slightly. Reporters clicked their pens into readiness. Even the dog, Rex, lifted his head as if recognizing the change in energy. From the rear of the courtroom, the bailiff opened the door. A hush fell so complete that the rustle of fabric could be heard as people adjusted in their seats. Through the doorway stepped a tiny figure, her hand clasped tightly in her mother's. Lily Harper was barely 3 years old, her small shoes tapping lightly against the wooden floor as she walked. She wore a pale yellow dress, the kind chosen with care by a parent who wanted her to look presentable but still innocent. In her free arm, she carried a worn stuffed rabbit with one ear drooping lower than the other. Every heart in the room softened at once. The contrast was striking. The hard lines of a courtroom, the severity of justice, and then this small child entering the scene like a fragile note in a heavy symphony. Even Judge Emerson's stern expression flickered with gentleness. The bailiff bent down, speaking softly. "Come along, sweetheart." He led her toward the witness stand, which loomed far too large for someone her size. With practiced ease, he lifted her onto the chair. Her feet dangled well above the ground, swinging slightly as she adjusted her stuffed rabbit on her lap. The judge leaned forward. "Good morning, Lily," he said, his tone noticeably softer than when addressing adults. The little girl looked up with wide blue eyes. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The audience melted into quiet smiles, though no one dared laugh. This was serious business, yet the innocence of the moment was undeniable. Judge Emerson nodded. "Now, Lily, you are very brave to be here today. I want you to remember something important. All we ask is that you tell the truth. Do you know what it means to tell the truth?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "It means not lying." "That's exactly right," the judge said warmly. "And if you don't know the answer to a question, it's okay to say you don't know. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said softly. The judge glanced at the prosecutor, who was already standing near the jury box. "You may proceed, Miss Mills." As the prosecutor approached, the air thickened again. Jurors sat straighter. The defense lawyer scribbled furiously in his notebook. The child hugged her rabbit closer, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces. Then, for just a brief moment, her gaze dropped to the floor where Rex the dog lay quietly. The corners of her lips lifted into a faint smile, unnoticed by most, but caught by the handler, Officer Daniels, who offered the smallest nod in return. This was no ordinary witness, and everyone knew it. The silence that had filled the courtroom before was nothing compared to the anticipation now. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first words of testimony from a 3-year-old child. And so it began. The silence in the courtroom stretched long after Lily was lifted into the towering witness chair. To the jury, she looked impossibly tiny, as if she were sitting at a table meant for giants. Her yellow dress bunched awkwardly against the polished wood, and the stuffed rabbit in her lap seemed almost as large as she was. The rabbit's fur was worn thin in places, the kind of wear that spoke of years of nightly hugs and whispered secrets. Everyone in the room felt the weight of the moment. Lawyers often talked about witnesses in terms of credibility, reliability, consistency. But now, credibility was embodied in a child who barely understood the word. Reliability sat dangling her feet above the ground, and consistency clutched a toy rabbit like a shield. The prosecutor, Karen Mills, moved slowly, deliberately, as if aware that every step carried meaning. She had built her reputation on precision, but here she needed something different: gentleness. She smiled softly at Lily, crouching slightly so her eyes were closer to the child's. "Good morning, Lily," Karen began, her voice warm and light, more like a preschool teacher than a courtroom attorney. Lily blinked at her, unsure. She squeezed the rabbit tighter. "Good morning," she whispered. Karen tilted her head. "That's a very nice rabbit you have. What's his name?" The little girl glanced down at the toy, then back up. "Mr. Hops." A ripple of quiet amusement passed through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's raised eyebrow. But even he could not keep the faintest smile from his lips. Karen nodded. "Mr. Hops looks very brave, just like you." She let the words hang for a moment, before gently shifting the subject. Lily, do you remember why you're here today? The child hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward her mother, who sat in the gallery, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her mother gave her a small, encouraging nod. Lily turned back to the prosecutor. Because something bad happened. Corinne's expression softened further. That's right. You're very smart. And you're not in any trouble, Lily. You're just here to help us understand what you remember. The jurors leaned forward. Some rested their chins on their hands. Others tilted their heads, all waiting to see whether this fragile witness would open the door to the truth. Defense attorney Paul Renner scribbled something in his notebook, shaking his head with theatrical disapproval. He was already preparing his objection, ready to argue that the child's answers were too vague, too malleable. But for now, he waited. Corinne continued carefully. Do you remember the night when the bad thing happened? Lily shifted in her chair. Her small legs swung back and forth, brushing against the wooden seat. She hugged Mr. Hopps tighter, as if trying to pull courage from the worn fabric. Yes, she said finally, her voice so small that the court reporter leaned closer to catch it. Corinne gave her a moment, not rushing. Then she asked, Can you tell us what you remember? The little girl's face changed, her mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes clouded with memory. For someone so young, recalling fear was not an easy task. She fidgeted, looking down at her shoes, then up at the ceiling. The entire courtroom waited. Seconds ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. The jurors grew restless. The defendant shifted in his chair, and even Judge Emerson tapped his pencil against the bench. Finally, Lily's small voice broke the silence. I was sleeping. And then I heard noises. Her words trembled, but they carried weight. The jurors scribbled notes. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly. What kind of noises, Lily? She tilted her head, struggling to find words. Like footsteps. And something opened. She paused, clutching Mr. Hopps. The door. Corinne's expression remained calm, but inwardly she felt a surge of triumph. Even in such a simple phrase, the child had aligned with the physical evidence. The back door had indeed been forced open that night. The defense attorney shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This child is too young to reliably interpret sounds. She could be remembering anything a dream, a story told to her after the fact. Overruled, Judge Emerson said firmly, his eyes narrowing. The jury will consider the weight of her words. Proceed. Corinne took a slow breath, aware that pushing too hard could backfire. She softened her tone further. That must have been scary, Lily. What did you do when you heard the noises? The little girl swallowed. Her small fingers twisted the rabbit's ear nervously. I stayed in bed. I was scared, but then I heard barking. At the mention of barking, Rex the German Shepherd lifted his head. His ears perked, eyes alert. The handler's hand brushed his fur lightly, keeping him calm, but the dog seemed to sense his role was being remembered. Barking? Corinne repeated gently. What kind of barking? The loud kind, Lily said, her eyes brightening slightly. Like he was saying, go away. Go away. The jurors smiled faintly, charmed by her description. But beneath the innocence was a vital truth. The police dog's bark had been documented in reports. And here was a 3-year-old confirming it without coaching, in her own words. Corinne leaned forward. Lily, do you see the dog who barked that night? The courtroom stilled. Every gaze turned toward Rex. Lily's eyes followed, and she lifted her small hand. Her finger extended, trembling only slightly, and pointed directly at the German Shepherd. Gasps echoed around the room. The defense attorney's pen froze mid-scribble. The judge's pencil stopped tapping. Even Officer Daniels shifted, caught off guard by the unexpected moment. "That's him," Lily said softly, her voice carrying more conviction than anyone expected. "That's the good doggy." He barked and scared the bad man away. The gallery erupted into murmurs, quickly silenced by the bailiff's stern glare. But the words lingered, echoing in every corner of the room. For the jurors, it was more than testimony. It was a child's unfiltered truth. She had not been led, not rehearsed. Her memory had surfaced naturally, drawn out by the gentlest of questions. And it connected the evidence in a way no adult explanation could. The defense attorney sprang to his feet again. "Your Honor, this is hearsay at best, imagination at worst." But the judge silenced him with a wave. "Sit down, Mr. Renner. The witness will be heard." The tension in the room doubled. The child had spoken. And though her words were simple, they carried the unmistakable ring of honesty. Rex lay quietly, tail flicking once against the floor, as if acknowledging his role. The courtroom, for a long moment, was utterly still. The testimony had only begun, yet already the foundation of the trial had shifted. And everyone knew, from this point forward, nothing about the case would be the same. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted since Lily pointed her small hand at the police dog. What had begun as a tense but ordinary day of testimony was now charged with new energy. Jurors leaned forward more eagerly, pens ready as if waiting for each word to complete a puzzle. The defendant, David Hensley, shifted uneasily in his seat, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between the child witness and his attorney. But to truly understand the gravity of Lily's words, one had to step back from the scene. This was not just a courtroom filled with lawyers and jurors. It was the culmination of weeks of investigation, interviews, and conflicting stories, all orbiting around one simple question. Had David Hensley broken into the Harper family's home that night? The break-in had shaken the quiet suburban neighborhood. On a humid summer night, while most houses rested in still darkness, the Harper home had been violated. The back door was found splintered, its frame cracked from force. Inside, a lamp had been knocked over, a window blind half torn from its bracket. There were scuff marks on the kitchen tile, fingerprints smudged on the refrigerator handle. But what mattered most was not what was taken, it was what was felt. Fear, the kind that seeped into the walls, clung to children's dreams, and left parents waking at every creak of the floorboards. For the Harpers, that fear had crystallized in their youngest, Lily. She had been asleep in her room when the intruder came. Though she hadn't seen the man directly, she had heard the sounds, the footsteps, the creak of doors, and most vividly, the sudden eruption of barking from Rex, the police K-9 assigned to patrol the area. The prosecution's case rested on weaving together these threads. They had fingerprint evidence, though smudged and partial. They had a neighbor who swore she'd seen Hensley lurking near the property days before the incident. They had Rex's alert and bark, documented in the handler's report. But none of it formed an unbreakable chain. Without Lily's testimony, the case was strong but circumstantial. With her words, it became something more. Karen Mills, the prosecutor, knew this well. Standing before the jury, she allowed herself a slow breath before resuming. She didn't rush to bombard Lily with more questions. Instead, she shifted her focus. "Your Honor," she said, "with the court's permission, I'd like to step back for a moment and review the evidence already presented, so the jury may better understand the importance of this child's testimony." Judge Emerson gave a small nod. "Proceed." Karen turned to the jury, her presence steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, over the past week, you've heard testimony from several witnesses. Officer Daniels testified about the forced entry at the Harper residence. He described the damage to the back door and the scuff marks consistent with a hurried entry and exit. You've seen the photographs." The jurors nodded faintly. recalling the image's splintered wood, shattered paint, the unsettling disruption of a family home. Karen continued, her tone measured. You've also heard from the forensic team. While the fingerprints collected were partial, they matched patterns consistent with the defendant's left hand. The defense has argued they are inconclusive, but they cannot be ignored. Finally, you've heard from neighbor testimony. Mrs. Callahan, who lives across the street, stated she observed Mr. Hensley near the Harper property 2 days prior to the break-in. Renner, the defense attorney, stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is restating evidence in a leading fashion. Overruled, Emerson said, his voice sharp. This is a review of presented material. Sit down, Mr. Renner. Karen resumed without missing a beat. All of this evidence paints a picture. But evidence, as we know, must be tied to human experience. That is why Lily Harper's words matter. She is not here to offer speculation. She is here to tell you what she heard that night, the noises, the fear, and the unmistakable bark of the police dog who intervened. The jury's attention returned to Lily, who sat quietly in the oversized chair, hugging Mr. Hops. Her presence, innocent yet unshakable, made the cold facts feel personal. The defense, however, was far from conceding. When it came time for cross-examination, Renner rose with deliberate slowness, smoothing his tie. He walked toward the witness stand, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor. He knew the risks of appearing too harsh with a child. Jurors might forgive a sharp question posed to an adult, but not to a 3-year-old with wide eyes and trembling hands. His approach would require delicacy, even charm. "Hello, Lily," he said, his voice gentle, almost syrupy. "My name is Mr. Renner. Do you remember me?" She shook her head. "That's okay," he said with a smile. "I'm going to ask you just a few questions, and then you'll be done. Is that all right?" She nodded, clutching her rabbit. "Now, you said you were sleeping that night. Is that right?" "Yes," she whispered. "And sometimes when people sleep, they dream. You know what dreams are, don't you?" "Yes," she said softly, though her eyes showed confusion. Renner leaned closer. "And sometimes dreams can feel very real, can't they?" Before Lily could answer, the prosecutor interjected. "Objection. Argumentative. Sustained," Judge Emerson ruled. "Mr. Renner, keep your questions within the scope of testimony." Renner adjusted quickly. "Of course, Your Honor." He turned back to Lily. "Lily, do you remember what color pajamas you were wearing that night?" The girl hesitated. She looked down at her lap, her cheeks flushing. I don't know," Renner pounced. "That's all right. You don't remember. And do you remember if your window was open or closed?" "I don't know," she whispered again. Renner spread his hands, turning briefly toward the jury as though to say, "See? She doesn't know details." Then he faced her again. "But you said you heard barking. Could it have been another dog? Maybe a neighbor's?" Lily's eyes flicked to Rex, who sat calmly near the handler. Her voice, though small, carried certainty. "No, it was him. The good doggy." The jury reacted instantly. Renner's lips tightened, realizing the child's conviction was stronger than his attempt to sow doubt. He offered a polite smile. "No further questions." Karen rose quickly, reclaiming the ground he had tried to unsettle. "Lily, you did so well." "Thank you." She gave the girl a reassuring nod before addressing the judge. "Your Honor, the state rests its case on this witness." The judge looked down at Lily. "Thank you, young lady. You've been very brave." The bailiff stepped forward to help her down, and the little girl scurried back to her mother's arms. Rex, sensing the shift, wagged his tail once, his eyes following her as though recognizing the bond they shared in that moment. With Lily gone from the stand, the courtroom returned to its stark seriousness. Yet her presence lingered, etched into the minds of jurors. What she lacked in detail, she had more than made up for in authenticity. Her words had transformed abstract evidence into lived experience. And for David Hensley, seated at the defense table, that was dangerous. His attorney leaned close, whispering urgently. Hensley's face hardened, his jaw set. For the first time, he looked less like a man falsely accused and more like a man cornered. The case was far from over. The defense would call their own witnesses, attempt to unravel the prosecution's narrative, and argue that a child's memory could not determine a man's fate. But the seed had been planted. The case at hand was no longer just about fingerprints or scuff marks. It was about the fragile honesty of a 3-year-old who believed in the bark of a dog and the safety it brought. And in that truth, the balance of justice began to tip. The stillness of the courtroom was so thick it seemed to press against the walls. Every cough, every creak of the wooden benches, even the faint rustle of a notebook page seemed amplified. The 3-year-old girl sat on the oversized witness chair, her small frame swallowed by the high backrest. Her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Hops, was clutched tight against her chest as if it were a life raft in a storm. Karen Mills, the prosecutor, crouched again so that her eyes were level with Lily's. She spoke with a tenderness that surprised even herself. "You're doing such a good job, Lily. Can you tell us what you remember about the noises that night?" The little girl's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. She looked down at the rabbit, rubbed its ear, then stared at her dangling shoes. Her silence stretched, and the tension in the courtroom grew unbearable. A juror coughed into his sleeve. Another scribbled in her notebook, but stopped midway, pencil hovering above the paper, as if waiting for something worth writing. Judge Emerson leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He did not speak, but his eyes softened. He knew children did not respond well to pressure. Time was needed. Patience was needed. Finally, Lily whispered, "I heard steps." Her voice was so faint the court reporter bent closer, fingers poised over the stenograph machine. Karen encouraged gently. "Steps. Very good. Do you remember where the steps were?" Lily's brows furrowed as she thought. "In the kitchen." This matched the physical evidence. Officer Daniels had testified about muddy prints found near the back door that led into the kitchen. The jury perked up at the confirmation. But then the silence returned. Lily stopped speaking. Her chest rose and fell quickly, like a bird caught in a net. Karen hesitated. She had to choose her next words carefully. Push too hard, and the child might clam up completely. Move too softly, and the testimony might dissolve into vague recollections. "Lily," she said slowly, "when you were in your room, were you scared?" The little girl nodded quickly, almost frantically. "What did you do when you felt scared?" "I hid under my blanket," she whispered. Several jurors smiled faintly, not at amusement, but at recognition. Who hadn't, as a child, believed a blanket could ward off all the terrors of the world? Karen let the moment linger before asking, "And when you were under your blanket, did you hear anything else?" Lily's eyes widened. She clutched Mr. Hops tighter, rocking slightly in her chair. The silence deepened. The defense attorney, Paul Renner, seized the pause like a weapon. He rose quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. This line of questioning is leading the witness into speculation. She's 3 years old. This entire testimony is unreliable." Judge Emerson held up a hand. "Overruled. The witness may answer if she is able." Renner sat down, though not without an exaggerated sigh designed for the jury's ears. Karen leaned closer, softening her voice to nearly a whisper. "It's all right, Lily. You're safe here. Can you tell us what you heard?" The little girl froze. Her lips trembled. She looked at her mother in the gallery, who gave a reassuring nod. But the child didn't speak. The seconds stretched unbearably long. Some jurors fidgeted. Reporters leaned forward, pens at the ready. The tension was almost unbearable, as if the entire room balanced on the edge of her tiny voice. Then, just as Karen prepared to move on, Lily whispered, "I heard barking." It was the first clear, strong word she'd said all morning. Barking. The prosecutor nodded gently. Barking. Can you tell us what kind of barking? Lily hugged her rabbit. Loud, like he was saying, "Go away, go away." Her description drew a ripple of smiles across the jury. Innocent, simple, but powerful. It was the kind of statement adults would never think to invent. Karen pointed subtly toward Rex, who lay obediently by his handler. "Do you see the dog who barked?" The courtroom held its breath. Lily's eyes fell on the German shepherd. For a long moment, she didn't move. Her tiny hands squeezed the rabbit tighter and tighter, her knuckles white. Her lips moved as though she were whispering something only the rabbit could hear. Then, slowly, her arm lifted. Her finger extended, trembling but steady, pointing directly at Rex. "That's him," she said, her voice stronger now. "That's the good doggy." He barked and scared the bad man away. Gasps erupted in the gallery. Even some jurors exchanged glances. The words were simple, but their impact was enormous. Renner leapt to his feet. Objection. Speculation. Imagination. Hearsay, take your pick, Your Honor. Judge Emerson banged his gavel sharply. Order. Sit down, Mr. Renner. The objection is overruled. The jury will weigh the testimony. The defense attorney sat, but his face was red with frustration. Karen, sensing victory but unwilling to press her luck, gave Lily a reassuring smile. You did so well, Lily. Thank you. She turned to the judge. No further questions. The judge leaned down. Lily, you've been very brave. You may step down now. The bailiff approached to help her from the witness chair. As she climbed down, she looked once more at Rex. The dog, as if understanding, thumped his tail against the floor. Lily smiled faintly before running to her mother's arms. The jurors watched every step she took. Some scribbled quickly, others sat back in thought. The child's hesitation, her silences, her whispered truths, they all felt real in a way rehearsed testimony never could. The courtroom slowly exhaled. The moment had passed, but its weight lingered. For the defense, Lily's hesitation had been an opportunity to undermine her. But her final words, spoken with conviction, had erased much of that doubt. For the prosecution, her pauses had been risky, but they made her eventual testimony even more powerful. She had not recited lines drilled into her. She had struggled, stumbled, and then spoken her truth. And for the jury, those hesitations, the moments where she seemed lost in memory, scared to speak, made her all the more believable. The case now hung on the fragile honesty of a child who had clutched a stuffed rabbit, whispered through fear, and finally found her voice. And in that voice, the trial shifted forever. The courtroom had learned to live with silence that morning. Silence when the child hesitated. Silence when she searched for words. Silence when she clutched her rabbit like it was the only anchor in a vast, frightening ocean. But this silence was different. It was heavier, electrified, as if everyone had leaned forward without realizing it, waiting for something no one could quite predict. Lily's small body shifted in the oversized chair. She stared at her lap, then glanced up, her eyes flitting nervously across the sea of strangers. The prosecutor, Karen Mills, gave her an encouraging nod. The judge waited patiently. The defense attorney sat back, his pen poised but unmoving. And then, without warning, the little girl lifted her arm. Her hand shook slightly, but the motion was unmistakable. She extended one finger and pointed straight across the room, not at the defendant, not at the prosecutor, not at her mother in the gallery. She pointed at Rex, the German shepherd lying calmly at the handler's side. The room gasped as if a single breath had been drawn and released by 100 people at once. The handler, Officer Daniels, stiffened in surprise. Rex lifted his head, ears perked, sensing the sudden attention. His tail brushed once against the floor, not wagging in joy, but flicking with awareness. The jurors exchanged startled glances. Some leaned forward, following the line of the child's tiny finger to the dog. Others scribbled furiously in their notebooks, as if writing it down would help them make sense of what had just happened. Karen froze for half a second. She had prepared for Lily to speak hesitantly, to clutch her rabbit, to perhaps murmur something about noises in the night. But this sudden, pointed gesture toward the police dog was a gift she hadn't dared hope for. "Lily," she asked softly, careful not to break the spell, "can you tell us why you're pointing at Rex?" The girl's lips trembled. For a moment, it seemed she might retreat into silence again. The entire room held its breath, waiting. Then her voice, small but clear, carried across the courtroom. "Because that's the good doggy. He barked and scared the bad man away." The words were simple, childlike, but they fell like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Reporters scrambled to capture every syllable. A juror covered her mouth with her hand. Another nodded faintly, as if a puzzle piece had just slid into place. The judge banged his gavel sharply. "Order in the court, order." But even his commanding voice couldn't erase the impact of the child's statement. Renner, the defense attorney, shot to his feet. His face was flushed, his tone sharp. "Objection. This is utterly speculative. A child of this age cannot possibly—" "Sit down, Mr. Renner," Judge Emerson said firmly. "Your objection is overruled. The testimony will stand." Renner's jaw tightened. He sat, scribbling furiously, though his eyes betrayed panic. He knew what the jury had just heard, and more importantly, how they had felt hearing it. Karen remained calm, but inwardly she felt a surge of triumph. She hadn't prompted the girl to point. She hadn't suggested the dog's role. It had come unbidden, straight from Lily's memory. And in its innocence lay its power. She asked gently, "Lily, can you tell us what you felt when Rex barked?" The little girl's eyes brightened, a fragile smile flickering across her face. "Safe," she said, "safe." The word was like a blade, cutting through the fog of legal arguments and forensic details. It wasn't about fingerprints or door frames or smudges of mud. It was about a child's primal sense of fear, transformed into safety by the bark of a dog. One juror wiped at his eyes. Another shifted uncomfortably, clearly moved but trying to maintain composure. Renner leapt up again, his frustration bubbling over. "Your Honor, this is nothing but emotional manipulation. The prosecution is parading a child's feelings in front of the jury." Judge Emerson's gavel came down hard. "Enough, Mr. Renner. You will restrain yourself. The witness has spoken." The defense attorney sat again, his face tight with barely contained anger. Karen knew better than to press further. She gave Lily a gentle smile. "You've done so well today." "Thank you, Lily." The judge leaned forward. "You may step down, young lady." The bailiff approached, lifting her carefully from the chair. As Lily was carried back toward her mother, she turned once more to glance at Rex. The dog, as if recognizing her gaze, thumped his tail against the floor again. The courtroom exhaled as though released from a spell. The jurors whispered among themselves. Reporters scribbled frantic notes, already drafting headlines in their minds. Even the judge leaned back, adjusting his glasses, his expression unreadable. But beneath the surface, the meaning was clear. The child had pointed. She had pointed not at the defendant, not at a stranger, not at something she might have imagined. She had pointed at the very dog whose bark was documented in the police report. The link between evidence and memory, between paper and lived experience, had been forged by a 3-year-old's trembling finger. And though lawyers would argue, objections would fly, and motions would be filed, the image was seared into the minds of the jury. A child pointing at a dog and calling him the good doggy who made her feel safe. For David Hensley, the defendant, it was devastating. He sat hunched at the defense table, his eyes fixed on the floor. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He knew the jury wasn't just hearing evidence anymore. They were seeing the crime through the eyes of a child. For the prosecution, it was a moment of unplanned brilliance. No amount of preparation could have scripted something so pure, so believable. And for the courtroom itself, it was unforgettable. In a world of legal jargon and technical evidence, it was the sudden point of a child's finger that cut through the noise. And everyone who witnessed it would remember it long after the trial ended. The sound of the gavel had barely faded when the hush returned. The air felt charged, as though the child's finger, still fresh in everyone's memory, had left an invisible mark across the room. Lily had pointed, and in that gesture, she had shifted the weight of the trial. But what came next would decide whether her testimony would remain a curious detail, or become the heartbeat of the prosecution's case. The prosecutor, Karen Niels, knew the risk of pushing too far. The little girl had already given more than anyone had dared to expect. But Karen also sensed that something lingered on the edge of Lily's lips, something unsaid. Children didn't point without reason. And this child, fragile, yet brave, was holding back. Karen's voice was gentle, almost like a lullaby. "Lily, when Rex barked, you said he scared the bad man away. Can you tell us more about what you saw or heard that night?" The question hung like smoke in the air. Lily's eyes flickered nervously. She hugged Mr. Hops so tightly the toy's ears bent backwards. Her legs kicked against the chair, not in impatience, but in the rhythm of a child searching for courage. The jurors leaned forward in unison, caught between the desire for answers and the fear of frightening her into silence. For a long moment, Lily didn't speak. She pressed her cheek into the stuffed rabbit's head and whispered something no one could hear. Some thought she might retreat into silence again. Even Karen wondered if she'd asked too much. And Lily lifted her head. Her voice, soft but steady, broke the stillness. He was there. The bad man. The words cut like glass. Simple, direct, irrefutable. A ripple of gasps spread through the courtroom. The defense attorney bolted upright. "Objection. Leading, suggestive, Your Honor, this is outrageous." Judge Emerson's gavel slammed. "Order. Sit down, Mr. Renner. The witness may continue." All eyes returned to Lily. She blinked, her small hand still pointing toward Rex. Her gaze was distant, as if she were back in her bedroom that night. "He tried to open the door," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "I heard the click-click, like when Mommy closes the door, but louder. And then Rex. He barked, loud, so loud. The man, he ran. I saw his shoes. They were dark. And he smelled like smoke." Each fragment was like a puzzle piece sliding into place. Karen's heart raced. The details, door clicks, dark shoes, smoke-matched evidence already entered into the record. The back door lock had been tampered with. The footprints near the threshold were from dark-soled boots. And the defendant, David Hensley, was a known chain smoker. Jurors scribbled furiously. Some exchanged meaningful glances. Renner, red-faced, leapt to his feet again. "Objection. This is fantasy. She's parroting what she's overheard." The judge shook his head. Overruled. "The jury will determine credibility." Lily hugged her rabbit closer, her voice growing softer. I was scared. I hid. But Rex kept barking. He barked, and the man ran away. She swallowed, then added almost defiantly, Rex saved me. That last phrase landed like a hammer blow. Reporters scratched their pens so hard, the sound echoed. A woman in the gallery dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Even the bailiff, stoic by training, shifted uncomfortably, blinking rapidly as if fighting emotion. The jurors couldn't look away. The innocence of the statement, the child's unwavering sincerity, rang louder than any lawyer's argument. It wasn't just testimony. It was truth, raw and unpolished. Renner sat down heavily, his pen clattering onto the defense table. His client, Hensley, stared at the little girl with a mix of disbelief and fury. He muttered something under his breath, but his attorney shushed him sharply, realizing every twitch, every scowl, was being absorbed by the jury. Karen let the silence linger, allowing Lily's words to settle. She knew she had reached the peak of the testimony. Anything further risked unraveling the moment. She smiled gently. Thank you, Lily. You've been so very brave. The judge leaned forward, his voice softer than usual. Lily, you've done your duty. You may step down. The bailiff moved to help her, but before she left, Lily turned once more to Rex. The German shepherd sat tall now, ears perked, as though sensing his importance. Lily gave him a tiny wave. Good doggy, she whispered. Rex's tail thumped against the floor, loud enough to echo in the still courtroom. The moment felt almost ceremonial, as though a child had crowned the dog a hero before the eyes of the law. When Lily was carried back to her mother's arms, the jurors watched her closely. Some smiled faintly. Others looked grim, weighing her words against the stacks of evidence in their binders. But none dismissed her. Not one. Karen returned to her table, her hands trembling slightly, though she masked it well. She knew the case had just shifted dramatically. Not because of hard evidence, though that was strong, but because of something juries rarely forget, the voice of a child telling the truth as she saw it. The defense attorney sat frozen, staring at his notes, but not seeing them. He knew how the jury had heard those words. He knew the case was slipping, and he knew that no amount of cross-examination could erase the memory of a little girl clutching a rabbit and declaring that a dog had saved her from the bad man. The judge finally addressed the jury. You have heard the testimony. It will remain for your consideration. His tone was calm, but even he could not disguise the significance. The trial pressed on with other witnesses, more evidence, more arguments. But in the minds of everyone present, Part 6 of this case had already been written. It wasn't in legal briefs or procedural notes. It wasn't in cross-examinations or exhibits. It was in the stunning words of a child. Rex saved me. And those words, whispered with the weight of innocence, echoed louder than any gavel. The echoes of Lily's small voice still lingered in the heavy air of the courtroom. Rex saved me. 3 words, uttered with the innocence of a child, had cracked through the fortress of legal jargon and courtroom theatrics. For a long moment, no one moved. The judge, gavel resting in his hand, seemed almost reluctant to break the spell. The jurors sat stiffly, pens frozen mid-sentence. Even the court reporter blinked, as though she wanted to be sure she typed the words correctly. It was as if the trial itself had stopped breathing. Then slowly life returned. A rustle of papers. The creak of a wooden bench. A muffled cough from the gallery. But the room was different now. The balance had shifted. Everyone knew it. The jury's eyes, the 12 jurors wore their reactions plainly. Juror number 3, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, but his expression soft. He had been skeptical throughout much of the prosecution's case, But Lily's words had pierced his defenses. Children, he thought, did not invent courage out of thin air. Juror number 7, a retired teacher, dabbed at the corner of her eyes with a tissue. She'd taught hundreds of children over 3 decades, and she recognized the authenticity in Lily's halting speech. Hesitation, detail, emotion, none of it sounded rehearsed. Juror number 9 scribbled furiously, filling half a page with notes. Dark shoes. Smoke smell. Dog barking. Safe. The juror underlined the last word 3 times. Even the jurors, who had remained stoic, showed subtle cracks, raised brows, faint nods, the slow shifting of posture that betrayed a change in perspective. The gallery murmurs in the gallery, whispers buzzed like an electric current. Reporters scribbled, already shaping headlines that would ripple through the evening news. 3-year-old declares dog saved her from intruder. Child witness names bad man, credits police dog. The public, ever hungry for stories of innocence clashing with danger, would feast on this testimony. The courtroom artists sketched feverishly, their charcoal pencils capturing Lily's tiny hand pointing at Rex. Spectators leaned toward one another, trading thoughts in hushed tones. Some shook their heads in awe, others in disbelief. A few openly wept. The bailiff scanned the room, his presence alone a reminder to keep order. But even he knew this was a moment too big for complete silence. The prosecution's quiet triumph at the prosecution's table. Karen Mills lowered her pen and allowed herself one measured breath of relief. She knew better than to gloat. Trials were marathons, not sprints. But inwardly, her heart pounded with triumph. Nothing in her years of experience had prepared her for this level of authenticity. She had relied on evidence, testimony, and cross-examination. But this was a gift. A child's truth, unpolished, carried more weight than any forensic report. She resisted the temptation to meet the jury's eyes too directly. Instead, she carefully stacked her notes, projecting calm control. She knew the jury had already seen what mattered. Still, she replayed Lily's words in her head, each syllable like a drumbeat. Rex saved me. That phrase would echo in the deliberation room. She was certain. It was more than testimony. It was a verdict waiting to be spoken. The defense's desperation on the other side. Paul Renner sat stiff, his knuckles white around his pen. He scribbled notes furiously, though his mind raced faster than his hand. Discredit child. Attack reliability. Highlight coaching. Stress imagination. But even as he wrote, he knew the uphill battle ahead. Jurors didn't easily dismiss children, not when their words rang with the unfiltered honesty of fear. And the details, shoes, smoke, the dog's bark fit too neatly with the evidence. Coincidence? Improbable. Coaching? Possible, but difficult to prove. He glanced at his client. David Hensley sat slouched, his face pale, eyes darting around the courtroom like a trapped animal. Every word the child had spoken seemed to weigh heavier on him. When Lily had mentioned smoke, his jaw clenched. When she said bad man, his fists balled tight. Renner leaned toward him and whispered fiercely, "Control yourself. Every twitch is being watched," but the damage was done. The jury had seen his scowl, his clenched fists. They had seen enough to connect the dots in ways no lawyer could control. The judge's gavel, Judge Emerson, finally broke the silence, his voice steady but softer than usual. The testimony of the witness is entered into the record. The jury will weigh its credibility alongside all evidence presented. His tone was measured, professional. Yet those who knew him could detect the faint shift, the weight he placed on the jury's roll, the acknowledgement that something profound had just transpired. He banged the gavel once more. "We will proceed." But even he, a man of decades on the bench, felt the tremor of the child's words echoing in the chambers of his mind. The defense's counterstrike. Renner rose, straightening his tie with the precision of a man masking nerves with ritual. Your Honor, at this time, the defense would like to call into question the reliability of child witnesses under the age of 5. Psychological studies. Karen was on her feet in an instant. Objection. The defense is attempting to lecture the jury on inadmissible commentary without expert testimony. Overruled, said the judge. Mr. Renner, if you wish to pursue this line, bring an expert witness during your case. For now, you will limit your argument. Renner swallowed his frustration. He had hoped to immediately blunt the impact of Lily's words, to sow seeds of doubt before they could take root. Instead, he found himself boxed in by procedure. He sat down, his face tight, knowing the prosecution had scored a victory not in law, but in hearts. The weight of innocence. For the rest of the session, the trial pressed on with other witnesses, each voice competing against the shadow of Lily's testimony. A locksmith explained how the back door lock showed signs of tampering. A neighbor described seeing a shadowy figure leaving the yard. A police officer recounted finding footprints in the mud. All useful, all important, but none carried the weight of a child's trembling voice, declaring that a dog had saved her from the bad man. The jurors listened politely, took notes, and nodded. But their minds kept circling back to Lily. Evidence was logical. Her words were emotional. And juries were made of people, not machines. The press outside, when court adjourned, the courthouse steps erupted with cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted over one another, broadcasting live updates to a nation now gripped by the testimony of a 3-year-old. Ladies and gentlemen, today the trial took an unexpected turn when the child witness identified the police dog as the reason the intruder fled. Her emotional statement has shaken the courtroom and may very well determine the outcome of this case. News outlets competed to frame the story. Some emphasized the bravery of the child. Others highlighted the credibility battle that would surely follow. But the common thread was clear. The prosecution had gained a powerful, perhaps decisive, advantage. The unspoken shift back inside, as the courtroom emptied, a subtle truth lingered. Everyone from the attorneys to the jury to the reporters knew the trial had changed course. The defense could argue. The lawyers could spar. Experts could testify. But nothing would erase the memory of that tiny finger pointing at Rex, followed by words too simple, too innocent, and too powerful to dismiss. Rex saved me. Those words were no longer just testimony. They were the spine of the case, the image burned into every mind, the phrase destined to resurface in the deliberation room. And as the day ended, the courtroom itself seemed to hum with the aftershock of innocence, breaking through the walls of doubt. The final day of the trial dawned with a sense of inevitability. The courthouse steps, usually crowded with reporters jostling for position, buzzed louder than ever. Headlines had been running for days. 3-year-old's testimony stuns court, and police dog credited with foiling intruder. Inside, the courtroom brimmed with the same mixture of tension and anticipation. The air was thick, not with silence this time, but with a restless hum of expectation. Everyone knew the end was near. Closing arguments, Karen Mills, the prosecutor, stood tall, her voice steady but burning with conviction. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, you have heard the evidence. The tempered lock, the footprints, the smell of smoke. You've heard the testimonies of experts, neighbors, officers. But most importantly, you heard from Lily. Not rehearsed, not prompted, but spoken from the heart of a child who lived through that night. She paused, letting her words settle. She told you what she heard. She told you what she saw. And she told you what she felt. Safe, because Rex barked and chased the bad man away. She had no reason to invent this. Her truth is simple, powerful, undeniable. And it points directly to the defendant. Karen gestured toward David Hensley. who sat rigid at the defense table, jaw tight. Justice demands accountability. Justice demands protection for the innocent. Today, justice demands a guilty verdict. She returned to her seat, every step deliberate. Paul Renner rose slowly for the defense. His tie was straight, his notes in order, but the strain showed in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone firm but tinged with desperation. "The prosecution asks you to convict a man based on the words of a 3-year-old child. A child whose imagination is as vivid as any toddler's. A child who, by her own admission, was terrified, hiding under a blanket, unable to see clearly. Are we to send a man to prison based on fragments from a frightened memory?" He paced, trying to recover ground. Yes, there were footprints. But could they not belong to anyone? Yes, the lock was tampered with. But does that prove beyond a reasonable doubt it was Mr. Hensley? And yes, the child said she smelled smoke. But she lives in a neighborhood where smoke drifts from chimneys, from barbecues, from any number of sources. Renner turned to the jury, his voice dropping. "Do not let emotion override reason. Do not let sympathy outweigh facts. Our system demands proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution has not met that burden." He sat down heavily, his client glaring daggers at the jury. The waiting the jury filed out, their faces a mixture of solemnity and determination. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs once again, then fell into uneasy quiet. Hours passed. Lawyers shuffled papers, whispered to their clients, sipped water they barely tasted. Reporters hovered, waiting for the signal to dash outside with breaking news. Lily and her mother waited in a private room nearby, shielded from the tension, but still wrapped in its shadow. Rex lay at his handler's feet, calm as ever, his steady breathing the only rhythm against the silence. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden slants of light through the courthouse windows, the bailiff entered. "The jury has reached a verdict." The words dropped like a stone into still water. The verdict. Everyone rose as the jury filed back in. Their faces gave little away, serious, focused, burdened by the weight of their decision. The judge addressed them. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" A woman in the front row stood. Her voice was clear, though heavy with responsibility. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk stepped forward, receiving the slip of paper. It was handed to the judge, who read it silently before returning it to the clerk. "In the matter of the State versus David Hensley on the charge of attempted burglary, how does the jury find?" The foreperson took a deep breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Gasps filled the courtroom. Some clapped hands to their mouths. Others nodded in grim approval. Reporters scribbled like mad, pens scratching furiously against paper. David Hensley slumped back into his chair, his face pale, his fists clenched. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, whispering words drowned out by the noise. Judge Emerson banged his gavel. "Order, order in the court." Silence returned, though it was no longer tense. It was resolved. After the verdict, Karen Mills closed her eyes briefly, a wave of relief passing over her. Justice, she felt, had prevailed, not because of her skill alone, but because a child's honesty had pierced through the layers of defense. Renner sat rigid, knowing appeals would follow, but also knowing the moment was lost. No jury would forget Lily's trembling finger and her words about Rex. The judge addressed the jury, thanking them for their service. Then he turned to the defendant. "Mr. Hensley, you will be remanded into custody pending sentencing." Two deputies stepped forward. Hensley stood, his head low, his chains rattling softly as he was led away. Lily returns later, when the courtroom had emptied and the reporters had rushed outside to deliver the story to the world. Lily and her mother were brought back. The little girl peeked shyly into the now quiet chamber. The tension was gone, replaced by a solemn peace. Rex, still sitting patiently beside Officer Daniels, lifted his head. His tail wagged once, then twice. Lily let go of her mother's hand and hurried forward. She threw her arms around the dog's neck, burying her face in his fur. "Good doggy," she whispered again. The room softened. Even the weary judge, gathering his notes, paused to watch the moment with something like a smile. For all the legal procedures, the hours of testimony, and the stacks of evidence, it was this image that lingered. A child hugging the dog who had made her feel safe. The legacy, the case would be remembered for years. Law schools would debate the admissibility and weight of child testimony. Reporters would recount the story of the brave little girl and the loyal police dog. But for the people in that courtroom, it wasn't about theory or precedent. It was about the raw, undeniable truth that had come from a child's lips. "Rex saved me." Those words had carried more power than any closing argument, more clarity than any forensic test. They had sealed the fate of a man and delivered justice in its purest form. And long after the verdict was filed, after the headlines faded, after the courtroom lights dimmed, that moment remained, a reminder that sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths.